Thank you for listening to The Path to Authenticity. My name's Tom Gentry. I think of this show as the opposite of small talk. You'll hear real conversations with real people who know who they are. We talk about what makes them who they are, how they became who they are, and how we might become truer expressions of who we are.
Hi, I'm Gina Moffa, and this is The Path to Authenticity.
If this is your first time here, thanks for checking it out. If not, thanks for coming back. I'm Tom Gentry, and this is The Path to Authenticity. Episode 222 with Gina Moffa, who is a licensed clinical social worker and the author of Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. A modern guide to navigating loss. So Gina's a friend of the show. She's been great to me. She was on the show for a double episode back in early 2021, episodes 114 and 115, which I'll link to in the show notes. But I wanted her to come on and talk about her book, the first of many, I'm sure. We had a really nice conversation. And, you know, Gina's just good people. That's all there is to it. And so many great people who I've gotten to meet as a result of doing this podcast. And Gina's right up there at the top. So thank you, Gina, for doing this episode. And this book is already doing great. It's going to continue to do great. It's written so well. It's just beautiful. So hope you enjoy this conversation with me and Gina Moffa. So, your book, I want to focus on your book.
Okay.
I'll link to the past episodes so people can learn about you and all that. You know, this will be the third episode that we've had together. The last time it was just such a long, gratifying conversation that I split it into 2 episodes.
That is true. We were on the phone 2 hours, I think. And at that time, I hadn't had a book. That time, I didn't even exactly know what I was going to be writing about. So I knew what I did every day for a living, which is grief and trauma work. But I didn't know what I was going to do about it. So it was really interesting to watch that, to now know the trajectory of it all.
Yeah, you know,
I've pretty crazy and exhausting.
I did a little IG live yesterday where I was talking about how some of these people who I've had on the podcast, some of them were authors already, you know, and we talked about their books. Mm-hmm. And then there are people like you and Jessica who didn't have books yet, but I knew were going to have books. And now she has a book that is everywhere, you know?
Yeah.
And now you have book that, when does your book come out?
It's available for pre-order now, but yeah, it comes out on shelves all around the world, as one would say, August 22nd.
Wow.
Which is really soon. And if anybody here is ever interested in writing a book or trying to write a book, I would love to talk to you about it because I feel a little bit like an expert who's gone through war. Been quite a process. So yeah, it's a very long process, but it is finally about to be out into the world, which is crazy.
Yeah. Well, tell everybody what it's called.
Okay, yes, it's a long title, and it's called Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. And it's a little bit sarcastic because I work with young people who are grieving, and by young I mean like 20 to 35 or whatever. And they're always coming in saying like, everyone wants me to just move on. Tells me I've got to let it go. And this is not just death losses, but this is different types of losses. Like friendship loss is a really big one in my work, and breakups and, loss of job, loss of career, loss of identity, businesses people have started and lost because of COVID. And no matter what the loss was, everybody kept coming in saying, people just expect me to let it go and get over it. And yes, we do have to move on. It is healthy to find relief in some way, and it is healthy to find a way to move forward with things. But it doesn't mean that that loss is gone, and it doesn't mean that that loss doesn't affect us indefinitely, and that we don't feel and need to process and experience everything that comes up with that loss. So it's a long way of saying why I have a long title to my book is to sort of be sarcastic. That just because we move on, it doesn't mean that we have to let go. We can still hold on and bring it with us in some way to honor it. So yes, that is the title.
Well, it's sort of, as someone who does this all the time, that's a common theme in grief, right? That I'm afraid if I heal and I don't think about how much it hurts as much, then I'm betraying the person I love, or some variation of that, right?
Yeah, and I think it's complicated in a lot of ways, because I think we get used to carrying the loss too. And yet it sometimes feels really secretive because society or maybe our communities don't always acknowledge it. So because it feels sometimes like it's more of a secret carrying, like we're carrying Linus's blanket with us, but we're the only ones who can see it sometimes, that it does feel like something we're hiding, and therefore it feels like it just is with us. It's a part of our identity in some way.
And if I don't hold on to that, then who am I?
Well, yeah. Yeah. I mean, because it's most times a big loss or a significant loss that creates grief or a grief experience. I mean, that's going to be something that you're not easily getting over anyway. It's going to be something that shapes you in some way. There's always going to feel like there's a before and an after. I mean, I imagine all of us could think of some life event or some series of life events that have shaped us where we see it in a before and an after, and still carry that either pain or residue of what was before.
Why don't you talk a little bit about how you came to specialize in working with people who are grieving?
I can do that. I came to grief by way of trauma. I was in social work school a million years ago in New York City here at NYU. And this was about the time that September 11th had just happened. And I was specializing in trauma. I was about to. And, everything that I was learning was, exactly what I was just talking about, a before and an after. And it was really hard for me to contend with the idea that we're talking about trauma, by way of the nervous system and the brain and all of this stuff, but we weren't really ever learning about or talking about loss. And many years later, I started working with Holocaust survivors here in New York City also. And, there was just so much grief. I mean, it's an identity of grief, and a life experience that is marked by loss. And yet it was always trauma we were talking about, not necessarily grief. And so I started to become really curious and fascinated by the relationship between trauma and grief. And in my field, for whatever reason, there isn't a ton of literature really linking them closely together. I mean, at least not for grief having trauma, but trauma having grief. And so I really just started realizing that in my own work, in my private practice later on, that anyone who came to me with trauma was also grieving. They were grieving something that happened before, the safety, the identity, the sense of self. I mean, all of it. And And yet it wasn't something that was acknowledged. And I just feel like we can't really do one without the other. And so part of my book, at least one of my chapters, is called Grief's Sister Trauma. Because I really want people to understand that, like, your loss or your experience doesn't have to be a traumatic one in order to feel traumatizing to you. And I think that once we acknowledge that people will have a reaction for a million reasons, whether it's, they have already a higher level of anxiety, or, or they have already suffered with complicated losses and trauma beforehand. Like a lot of different things can really cause and add to a more complicated loss experience. But basically, I just felt like we needed to give people permission to call and acknowledge something that felt really traumatizing and grief, inducing, to be what it is. And so that's really kind of how I came to know grief. And it really is just through studying and specializing in trauma for many years. Long-winded answer, Tom. Long-winded answer.
So if there's one aspect of grief that you are repeatedly explaining to, let's say, new clients, the one thing that you come across that is most common that people don't understand about grief that you find yourself explaining repeatedly, what would that be?
I would say more recently it would be that grief is a full body experience. It's not just our feelings, but it is processed through our bodies and through our nervous systems. And that if you're going to do any kind of grief work whatsoever, to make sure it's something that includes all of your body. For me, when I lost my mother, my grief, I was a therapist and I thought I really had this one in the bag, and I was like, I got this. I do this all day. No, like by my ignoring it, grief showed up in my body. I wound up in the ER with pancreatitis. I had the onset of diabetes. I had a thyroid problem. I mean, and it happened fairly quickly. And it was really that I was not allowing in anything. I was just going. I was trying to work again, and there was just a lot going on, but I wasn't really acknowledging that my body was breaking down. I was getting headaches, stomach problems. I mean, it was big for me in my body. And I think so many people are like, oh, it's just my feelings. I feel bad. And I'm like, we've got to take care of our bodies when we're in a state of loss. We have to make sure that we're getting rest, even if we're not able to sleep, but just to rest our bodies, to make sure that we're drinking water. I mean, if I could have had somebody remind me to drink enough water, it sounds so simple when you're not in this state. But when we're grieving, we're not really thinking of taking in nourishment because we're bereft, or we're in a state of trauma, or we're in a state of survival, or we're just simply shut down. And so we're not really thinking of how can I nourish my body today? No. I mean, most people would tell you they needed to be reminded, or they needed somebody to bring food. I mean, that's really part of why it's such a ritual to bring people food, because people don't have the instinct when they're grieving to take care of their bodies. So I would say if you know anyone who's grieving, or you yourself have been grieving or going through loss of any kind, take care of your body first and foremost. Get movement, any kind of movement, not very fast movement though. I wouldn't do cardio. We don't want to put your body into fight or flight. So I would do something slow. I would take walks. That's my favorite thing to do, and tell people any kind of like stretching, yoga, Pilates, if that's your thing. But I would, for a while, try to stay away from very fast cardio. Just to let your body have some time to heal itself, to process and digest, what it's going through emotionally in a kind of a slower way, and not through fight or flight.
One of the things that's interesting to me about grieving is that I think, well, most of the time when we think about grief, we think of big losses, people dying in our lives, parents, spouses. And, it can really be a lot more sort of granular than that, what I've come to learn. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the things that people have grieved, who you've helped, that maybe would be surprising for a listener to hear about, or maybe even surprised you that, wow, I didn't know that this was an experience of grief?
Right now I don't feel surprised by any type of grief. But I would say, actually, I want to go to another personal experience just because I'm surprised at it. When I lost my mom, that same week, my job closed down. The organization where I was a director closed, came back to my apartment, and my building was sold. So all within the span of a few days, I lost my mother, my home, and my job. And so I went to a restaurant nearby that I frequented for many years, twice a week. And, it was a regular, just sort of my safe place where I would meet friends, and it would be my headquarters. And I go there, and that very night, the manager comes up to me and says, "Gina, this is terrible news, but, we're closing tonight. We got into a landlord dispute and we're closing our doors." And that seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I was devastated by the loss of this restaurant. And people were like, "What do you mean? Your mom died. Like, why are you upset about Ocean Grill closing?" And I'm like, "You don't understand. This was my home away from home. Like, I would go there and they would know what I needed to eat. And they just knew it just was a place where you went in and it was like cheers, and to this day, people might think, and I do write about it in my book, people might think it's pretty insane. But, I think that started it out for me. Like, there's no crazy thing to grieve, right? Grief is really the loss of anything meaningful to us, anything significant to us. And that can be anything. I mean, I've had people grieve childhood homes. I've had people grieve books that they lost in a move. And it really is so unique. It's such a unique, subjective experience. And nobody will ever truly understand your loss and the meaning behind that loss outside of you. We try, but it is really hard. So now I don't feel surprised. It's really what is meaningful for you.
Yeah. One of the big grieving experiences for me in my life was a change in leadership at a place where I worked,
Yeah.
And it's happened more than once, where the first one was Hanley Hazelden, in West Palm Beach, which has changed hands 2 or 3 times. But, I got sober there. My sister got sober there. My parents went through the family program there. I trained as a counselor there. I met my son's mother there and have all these memories of him running around there as a toddler. And that's just the personal part of it. I'm like, have a lot of pride about how I was trained and who trained me, and just how ethically sound it was and how professional it was. And then, they went through this thing where they had the same executive director for a decade and a half, who everybody thought he was a retired priest, but he wasn't. He just he left the priesthood for a period of time. And one day he said, "I'm going to go back in a year." And so Hazelden did this year-long search to replace him, and ended up hiring someone who was running a publicly funded facility literally down the street after looking for a year. And it just was never the same. He disempowered all the women who were in leadership there. He brought in this army of people who he knew would be loyal to him. He convinced the family that they needed to leave Hazelden. It was just a mess. And I ended up, it really shaped my career, because I kind of saw it all coming and said, I don't feel good about this anymore. I'm not proud to work here anymore. And I quit. And,
Wow.
and it was like a bumpy road after that. But I stood up for what I believed in, and like, you know, that became how a lot of people saw me, you know, which was great. And, but also there were so many relationships that I had where some people chose to stay and a lot of people chose to stay. And I watched them over and over again find themselves in these situations where they were escorted out by security when they were, I mean, it was crazy.
Wow.
It went on and on for years. And then eventually they sold to Karen, who then sold to Origins. And, you know, it just was really painful to watch. Yeah. And then a few years later, I had another job where I left before it got crazy, you know, again, but
I hear this a lot.
Yeah.
I'm hearing this a lot.
And it's not unique to this industry. I mean, it happens in
Right.
other industries too, but I've always been the type of person, if I work somewhere, I have to really believe in it. I have to feel invested in it. And I really haven't been since that happened the second time, you know, and it's been a growing experience because I've learned to be more invested in myself.
Yeah. Trust yourself more.
Right. And not to need that. But it's definitely been a grieving experience, you know, multifaceted grieving experience.
Yeah.
And another one for me that I think people maybe even scoff at a little bit is grieving the person I might have been had things been a little bit different in my childhood.
Yeah.
Or even early adulthood or different times of life. But grieving the loss of who I might have been. I think that's one a lot of people carry around and never acknowledged, let alone address.
Absolutely. People who endure accidents, people who have chronic illness diagnoses, people who become caretakers of people with chronic illness diagnoses. I mean, this is all that is a very big thing. I'm glad you brought it up, that nobody really acknowledges is what was and what could be. That when nothing is ever the same, right? When we can say that line, nothing was ever the same, or nothing would ever be the same, or what could have been, what might have been if, and then fill in the blank. And that is a grief that we don't acknowledge as a society, because we're the buck up and pick yourself up by your bootstraps and keep it moving and positive vibes only, and sometimes toxic positivity. But what we don't, when we don't acknowledge and honor those might have beens, it's really isolating and lonely and devastating, and can really lead to what can feel like almost debilitating sadness. I've noticed in my work too. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that, as someone who cares a lot about men, and I see myself as a men's advocate, I think one of the things that I'm interested in exploring and learning more about is, you know, as males, we go through this indoctrination where as children, we're basically taught at 4 or 5, you can't be that emotional anymore because boys don't, it's more subtle than the boys don't cry. That's usually how we think of it. But, but it's basically the range of emotional experience that's acceptable for us to have as males just shrinks. Right.
Yeah.
And that's a loss. That's a loss. It's in a way, it's, you're not allowed to be who you really are anymore. You have to pretend to be someone else.
I wonder if it goes back so far that it prevents a child from even ever knowing who they are to begin with.
Well, I think that's the story of my life, I mean, in a way,
I mean, we're laughing, but it is what you were saying.
How can you know who you are if you don't know how you feel because you're taught to ignore it?
Yeah.
And
well, I mean, that can go a lot of different ways for a lot of different populations that are marginalized also. But since we're talking about men specifically, for sure.
Well, it's everyone. It's everyone. These things I'm talking about with men, it's true for women too, just to a different magnitude. Right.
For sure. And of course, I go straight also to the LGBTQIA plus community where, we're still fighting for rights and all of that. So it is very interesting. And it's just, what do people get out of other people not being able to acknowledge who they are or learn who they are? I don't really know still to this day what it's all for.
Yeah. Yeah. That's been painful for me to watch what's been happening with that because, there are people who are really, really important to me that fall into that category of, people who, are, it's like they're supposed to be ashamed of who they are. And,
correct.
And I think maybe
it's just,
and really what's changed, I think for me in my lifetime, and maybe it's similar with you. When I was a kid, if you were homosexual, you were on the fringe.
Yeah.
You just were. And you were treated like an outsider and often ridiculed, let alone trans or anything resembling someone who had a gender identity issue. It's just you were definitely an outsider. And what I see now, having a son who's going to be a senior in high school in the fall, where he goes to school, is that everybody's treated with love. That's the difference. And what I don't get is, how can you be mad at that? Right? What kind of person does that make you if you're upset because people who 30, 40 years ago would have been treated like something other than human, and now they're just treated as valid, just treated as human beings with the love that they deserve? What makes that problematic?
Yeah. I mean, we could talk all day.
I don't get it. It's just crazy. But I think to your question, maybe what it is that, why people have trouble with this idea of allowing someone to be who they are. Maybe it's something related to, well, I didn't get to be who I am, so why should you get to be who you are? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it is possible. It's definitely not, I mean, talk about the opposite of coming from a place of love, right? I mean, there are people who come from a very abusive background with, maybe a parent who is a substance abuser who was then abusive, and they do whatever they can to make sure that they're a loving and kind parent who, is attentive and present and allowing of their child to be whomever they may become. And then there are people who go the other way. And we have this, way of saying, well, hurt people. And despite it being a truth, it sometimes gives allowance for that at times, and I think we have to be very careful.
Well, it absolves people of responsibility sometimes. It's
right.
I think we let people off the hook because of it. But this happens with, people who grew up in families where their parents just pound into them, you have to be a doctor or an attorney or whatever it is, and don't even allow them the latitude to think about what they would actually like to do with their lives.
Absolutely. It's true.
Am I talking about your caseload here?
Basically, yeah. I mean, part of that, it's really interesting because people will come to me with, say, a primary loss, And it would be perhaps a death loss or a divorce or, the loss of a career or something very big to them. And as we sort of go through, and this is sometimes why therapy gets a bad rap, is because we do look at the whole picture. But in doing that, sometimes it does feel worse before it gets better, because what we realize is that this isn't the first major loss, and that there have been all of these other mini losses that they haven't been able to or allowed to grieve or acknowledge or honor. And so it is really interesting, because this wouldn't be kind of the thing somebody comes in with, so to speak, but it would be something that would develop when we sort of do more of a deeper exploration of, what is another time you may have felt like this, and when is another time your nervous system may have been this up in arms? Wow. This doesn't feel new. This feels like it's threaded back to something else. Let's look at that. And sometimes people don't want to, right? Because most of the time we know that we're not coming from a perfect past, but that's not the point. The point is really, if we can, let's clean out the wound. Let's heal the whole system so that you can move forward in a way that brings you hope, in a way that brings you a sense of freedom, and I think people can be fearful of, looking back into their childhoods, because it's terrifying sometimes, or, it just feels so burdensome. But I think if we can really stay curious without any judgment to it, or the need to blame, right? I don't need to blame people's parents in order to acknowledge a painful childhood. Facts are just facts. We don't have to attach a story to it or blame to it, but it is important to still acknowledge. And I think if we don't, the grief is there, but is it ever really truly cleaned, the wound? And that's a question that's, different for everybody, but I certainly love exploring it.
Yeah. And, one of the things that's been interesting to me that I've sort of pondered over the last year or so is that, and even longer, I'm interested in these things. I want to talk about these things. I want to explore these things, but not everyone does.
Yeah, that is very true. I see it every day.
Well, and sometimes it's because they're so stuck that they're afraid to. And sometimes it's just because they're not into it.
Absolutely. And you know what? Sometimes it's people don't have the strength and I don't mean strength as in courage, but I mean, sometimes they don't actually have the physical stamina and the endurance to go through it. Sometimes people, since COVID, have had a lot of people coming to me with really pretty devastating losses early in their lives. And, it's so tiring, or they're, a loss of somebody I had somebody who lost almost her entire family to COVID, people all over the country also. And, with somebody like that, I'm not going to go diving into their childhood. I'm not going to go diving into other losses they've had. I'm just going to help them regulate their nervous system as best they possibly can. Because from the standpoint of the brain, they're just in a trauma response again and again and again. So we have to really, and this is kind of why I really tout therapy over coaching at times, is because of the training that we go through to really understand the neuroscience behind what people are going through, and also being trained to really look at several things at once and make sure that we're not opening up something we can't close, or we're not opening up something for someone that they can't tolerate, or that their nervous system can't tolerate. It's really, how do we create a safe place, or a safe enough place that they can actually define it as safe, right? Because what I think is safe doesn't mean my client thinks it's safe. And so it's important to really do your best to create a safe place along with somebody, for them to be able to explore that if they can. And I think that it's what I always say to my people coming in is like, you're the captain of the ship. Like, I know the waters, but I'm not going to row this. I'm not going to steer this ship for you, because if it's too much, we're not going to do it. There's, if it's too overwhelming, if your body is really expressing a lot of fatigue or, distress, we're just not going to go there. And it is the permission to not grieve and the permission to not process. But I do think that inevitably in the long term, it would be good to go there someday. But I think the savvy, I guess I could say, for us in the field would be to really know when and how much, and how to create and sustain that safety.
Yeah. There's something really, one of the things I love about what you just said is understanding and honoring people and allowing them the dignity of knowing that they're capable of healing themselves. They're the ones that are doing it.
Yeah.
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 And
I'm just a traveling companion. That's what I call myself.
right.
I am a privileged traveling companion. And we go on a lot of country roads, right? But,
Bumpy.
right, right.
Right.
And, but sometimes there's some beautiful flowers by the side of the road, and sometimes there's some nice cows to look at and sing to. And, and there's no rush. And I think there can be a real beauty to the process and a beauty to the journey of it. If we can get to a place of being stable, and feeling safe. But, grief and trauma can really upend us and upend our nervous systems. And so it can feel really treacherous at times, which is why I think the person with whom you decide to take that journey has to be very, and I don't want to say special, but I think they have to be very attuned to you, and you have to be able to feel and internalize that.
Yes. Yes. It's all about that connection, right?
Yeah. I always say that most of all, if anyone is ever looking for a therapist of any kind, first and foremost, I say, well, I wouldn't look for a cardiologist in a podiatrist's, handbook. So if you can find somebody that is specialized in what you need, amazing. But beyond that, and most importantly to the healing process itself, would be to make sure that you feel a connection, that there's chemistry, that it feels like this person gets you. And if they don't, that they want to get you.
Right.
And that they want to create a safe place that is safe for you, and not just because they say it's safe.
Right.
And yeah, so and I think that's really hard for people who may not have access to therapy or be able to afford somebody that feels like a good fit, or, a million reasons. But I still think that there are people out there who care and who can help create a healing environment for people who really want it. So we need more healing.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome. I knew it would be. And I want to ask you about something else. You mentioned the process of writing this book and what that's been like for you. And I know, as someone who is engaged in that process, what I find myself doing a lot, and I've written all my life in one way or another and published a lot, but I've never written a book. But I find myself asking, what are you really trying to say? And in the process of writing it has been just a process of clarification over time. And really, it's like I have the message inside, but trying to figure out how to get it out and articulate. Like, I know what it is in my head, but how do I say it in a way that other people are going to get it? And, and it's felt like such a growth experience. And a lot of it has unfolded here on Clubhouse, just the forum where I'm talking and hearing myself and hearing how other people respond to the things I say. What's this process been like for you?
Oh boy. I wish it could sound as poetic and wonderful as this sounds. I think, when you have a book deal with a major publisher and they own you basically, you have a deadline. And for me, I was working pretty much 12-hour days and volunteering at the same time with people during COVID, because there just wasn't enough help and people were losing at a very alarming rate. So I just felt like I didn't have any bandwidth, but I had 4 months to write a book. But for me, if I really think about it, I work with a lot of young people who are facing grief for the first time, but this applies really to any age group, which is to really try to change the conversation around loss, to teach people that you can be grieving and to understand that you may be grieving things that are not death-related losses, and to bring a voice to that, to bring honesty to that, and to bring hope to that, to bring curiosity to that, and to also help people navigate their needs after a loss, right? I mean, I talk a little bit about how to plan for outings, how to plan for dating, how to talk to your job, how to go back to work. You know, we don't have great bereavement policy in this country, which is sort of the entire problem, that people don't view loss as something that is life-changing. And yet it is the most universal human wound that everyone will face at some point or another. And yet it just does not get the attention and I think the tenderness that it really deserves. So, you know, part of that for me at the time was understanding that a lot of people who were calling me from small towns who did not have access to therapy, let alone a grief specialist or a trauma specialist, or people even here in New York, I just, you know, my practice was full for so long and I just felt so helpless. I deeply want to help people. And yet, you know, there was just so many hours in a day. And so for me, it was, how do I help people have access? How can I write a book that makes somebody feel like they're in a therapy room with me and that I actually freaking care? And how do I get that point across? Because I do care. And, you know, not just having experienced loss myself quite a bit, but, you know, seeing it, witnessing it, and, you know, experiencing it along with people. And then knowing that people just did not have that access felt really just urgent to me. So in a way, I can be grateful that I had a 4-month deadline. But you know, it was really hard to work all day with loss and with trauma and write a book in the other hours about loss and trauma. And then I had a death in my practice at the same time. So I was experiencing a different level of grief. So I don't have a romantic notion of this book, but I do have a mission and I do have a sense of urgency that it was something I wanted to get out for people who had yet to find a book that was perhaps clinical or gave enough tools in a way that spoke to them specifically. I mean, it felt like an urgent mission for me. And I don't mean that in a way that feels arrogant whatsoever. But just for people with whom I was working, who were like, this is, you know, therapy is good, but what do I do between? Do you have a book to recommend? And I remember saying like, yes, there's this, and this. And they would say like, okay, that's great, but that was just written by a widow or a widower. And I don't identify with that. Or this was written by somebody who's religious and I don't identify with that. And it just felt like there weren't any clinical grief books out there that weren't super clinical. Like, I'm not going to talk in a way that people don't understand, but I also want to teach you to understand what's going on with you and your experience so that you know, so that you can help yourself and feel empowered too. And so that was really the catalyst for this particular book. And it's in pre-sales now. And, you know, I'm terrified. It's always very scary to put something out in the world and you hope somebody will order it. But it still feels really important. So if one person who doesn't have access to therapy gets some kind of help from that, my whole world is made, truly. So that's my long answer. That is less poetic and wonderful as yours, but very much true.
Well, I want to thank you. You know, this whole idea for this podcast, you know, I've always wanted it to be about being authentic and to talk to people who are authentic. And I can say wholeheartedly that not only in the interactions we've had recording, but even more so in the interactions outside of that you have shown me what it's like to interact with someone who is real. And it's been such a gift to get to know you. And, you know, it's fair to say that you've given me hope for humanity. And, that's not an overstatement. And I think people should definitely read your book. And I want you to tell people where they can find you.
Sure, I would love that. And I feel the same way about you, Tom, and you know that. And I'm truly grateful for our friendship. It's been several years now, so I'm grateful that you believe as much as I do in being real and understanding that people have ruptures and they repair, and that there's hope for us yet, that we can all come together, because there seems to be such a divide in the world. So I'm very, very grateful for you and all you do here and outside of here. Just had to say that. You can find my book anywhere books are sold. If you're interested, I would be so deeply grateful. It is moving on, doesn't mean letting go. My name is Gina Moffa, just in case. And you can buy it Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org.
You can follow Gina on Instagram. What's your handle?
Oh, yes, Gina Moffa, LCSW. I would love it, and please say hello if you are.
Thanks for listening to the show. Please subscribe, leave a rating or a review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can learn more about my other podcasts by visiting thepathtooauthenticity.com or by clicking the link in the show notes. Music is by the band Punk Rock Opera, used under a Creative Commons license and with permission from the artist. The show is produced by me, Tom Gentry. You can find more of my work on Substack, including a podcast only available to paid subscribers. So again, thanks for listening. Keep coming back. Be nice.
You did great, honey.